Thanks a lot, Mrs. Ambassador. And now we'll go on with our second panel, the one, the Blue Economy Potential, Funding and Sustainability. And so I ask on stage again, our wonderful moderator, John, and also our panelists. So Jeff Waters, Geneviève Connors, Jonathan Kelsey, and Laurent Corbel. So please, the stage is yours for another 55 minutes.
Hello. There we go. They're all live. What did you get out of the last panel? Anything? What'd you learn? Something. Maybe one thing. Laurent. Putting you on the spot.
Thank you very much, John. No, my big, I use the BB&J acronym further and no high security or.
Cannot hear. Okay.
Is it better? Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a little boilerplate in a moment on what this panel is, I think, hopefully going to be about, but maybe we'll meet the panelists first and go from there. Maybe we'll start at the far end and work this way. Just introduce yourself and give us that same routine as last time. Give us a little sense in regard to a blue economy, because that's what we're talking about.
Great.
Any sense of optimism? Short.
All right, great.
Yeah.
So my name is Jeff Waters. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs at Ocean Conservancy. We're a US-based environmental nonprofit, but we work globally. My sense of optimism, just introduction first?
Yeah.
Jumping into optimism.
That'd be great.
So I can tell a story later, but I will
expound upon it later, but just give me a little hint of what gives you optimism.
The main thing is the drive. Like, it's easy to get lost in all the conversations that we're talking about, but the drive behind the fact that all of these conversations exist, and the passion for people to have an active defiance to solve these seemingly unsolvable problems, that is my sense of optimism.
Yeah, which is a big change, right? In the last decade, 20 years?
Absolutely.
And we can explore that a little bit given your variety of vast experiences, but that's my impression, is that things are changing fast.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Kelsey. I'm the director of the Bloomberg Ocean Fund. We're a re-granting partner of Bloomberg Philanthropies Ocean Initiative, and the Bloomberg Ocean Fund is housed in Oceans 5, which is the world's leading ocean conservation re-granter. We support efforts around the world in 3 key areas. First, we support equitable and inclusive efforts to help the world, help communities, governments, civil society organizations make progress towards Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, 30 by 30 in the ocean, as was discussed in the previous panel. We also promote efforts that target countering illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, both in countries' waters as well as in the high seas, areas beyond national jurisdiction. And in that way, we also promote new and better policies that make more information available to the public to hold governments and other industry players accountable for their actions on the ocean, specifically around fisheries management. And then lastly, we support efforts aimed at protecting and conserving the most climate resilient coral reefs around the world, what we call the 50 reefs set of coral reefs that exist around the world. And we can talk a little bit more about that later as well. A couple of things that give me optimism quickly. First of all, when we think about blue economy and finance, by virtue of the work that we support, my mind and my thinking goes straight towards what does it take to conserve and protect ocean biodiversity, conserve and protect nature in the ocean. And in that way, I'm really optimistic about what has happened in the integration of finance into the governance solutions that have been adopted in the past few years. And Rita and others talked about those in the previous panel. The Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the work to advance the treaty for conservation and protection of areas beyond national jurisdiction, the BB&J Treaty. Both of those key and formative instruments that have been adopted include strong finance provisions. The Global Biodiversity Framework includes a target to mobilize $200 billion for nature and biodiversity per year by 2030, and in that a target for $20 billion mobilized per year by the end of this year, $30 billion per year by 2030 that will flow finance from the north to the global south. Really key provisions. The High Seas Treaty, the BB&J Treaty, includes a provision that sets up a special fund that will ensure that there are resources available for developing states to be able to participate in the governance of the high seas of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So I'm really optimistic that we're integrating finance into our governance solutions, and look forward to talking more about what's next now that we have some of these frameworks in place.
Right, and that picks up perfectly as to where the last panel ended, which is how can philanthropies become more involved, and are they? Jen.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen, or Genevieve Connors, or Geneviève Connors, depending on your nationality. I'm currently the acting global director for environment at the World Bank. I'm not a marine biologist. I'm not married to a marine biologist. I don't have a strong background in blue. I'm actually a repentant urban planner who's come to love the environment, and I've worked in climate change and environment for the last 10 years at the World Bank. Lots of things give me optimism.
But you're totally qualified to talk about the blue economy.
But I'm totally qualified to be here. Check. Lots of things give me optimism, but you asked for just a snippet. So maybe what I'll start by saying is that I think we're talking a lot about things moving fast and new progress, but the thing that I took away from the last panel was how many people have been in the fight for so long. That this is a decades and decades and hundreds of years battle for the ocean. And so one of the things I'd like to note is the increasing focus, or maybe the emphasis that I'm seeing on the integration of ocean health and economic development, and the focus on people. And at the end of the day, I work for a development institution that's focused on poverty reduction, and I think focusing on the importance, yes, of ocean, not oceans, high seas, of course, treaties, of course, but at the end of the day, who's this for? These ecosystems we talk about, mangroves, wetlands, what are they generating? They're generating services for people, they're generating jobs for people, they're generating livelihoods for people. Hundreds of millions of people live on the coastlines of our world, and over 3 billion people depend in one way or the other on the ocean as a lifeline for jobs, for their economies, for growth. And so I'm not sure this is necessarily new, but I'm optimistic that this link to people is what gives us hope to drive investment and to drive change at a faster pace, maybe, than we've seen over the many past decades.
And are there if you're noticing, as we all are, the longevity of these careers fighting these same, or engaging in these same issues, are you seeing, to use military analogy, are you seeing troops come up from behind? Are there increasing numbers of young people who are, coming to join this fight, for lack of a better term?
I think that's an easy yes. Even from the perspective of someone who manages teams at an institution like the World Bank, every year the kinds of the people coming in who are looking for jobs, let's say in their 30s, have completely different degrees than I do, than you do. They come from different backgrounds. They have much more interdisciplinary backgrounds, and they're really committed to the environment and to a livable planet. Not that we weren't, but in much greater numbers.
Great. Laurent?
Yes, good morning. First of all, thank you for the French Embassy for inviting us. I grew up in Brittany, France, so it's quite an honor to be here today at the French Embassy. I moved to New York 20 years ago, working for financial institutions, helping them, providing them software to comply with sanctions, control export. So it's still much more in the news, but in 2020, I think that maybe I was looking for more optimism or something different. And inspired by a few entrepreneurs from France, I decided to jump into maritime shipping. And it was a shock for me at that moment to find out that, let's say, out of 50, 60,000 commercial vessels, I would say 10 of them were able to harness the wind to reduce their fuel consumption. And for me, it was just obvious that this would change. Having no background in maritime at all, I honestly had no clue how to ride that wave, and decided to produce a podcast to sort of document those changes. Also work with universities, colleges in the US to transfer, or at least give that information to the student that decarbonization of maritime will require a mix, and wind can be part of that. Optimism is definitely the reason I jumped into that. When I feel down, I'm calling one of the many people I interviewed over the past 4 years. Each of them share 2 or 3 common patterns, I would say. They're fighting headwind. They're either building equipment, they're either building ships, or they're actually deciding to use zero-emission wind power sailboats to transport their goods. But if each of them is sort of passionate, animated by a drive that is beyond, I would say, themselves, it's really a drive for the ocean. And as Jen was saying, I think most of them, this is not their first career. They're not young, but they've realized that having an impact, a meaningful job is really what they want. And they give me hope and optimism every time I talk to them.
Nice, nice. I work a lot in the environmental space, and people ask me where I find optimism, and it's in what I call people who I identify as accidental environmentalists. You know, they did not set out to, to fight the pipeline that's running through their backyard, or the poisoned water in their school, but now they're passionate, 24/7, committed. I mean, these are that's where I find optimism. Yeah, I didn't mention it the last time around, but I have a great interest in human rights on the sea. We made a beautiful film called Ghost Fleet, which is all about the fact that most men who work on commercial fishing boats, and they are all men, are enslaved. And we found some hope and optimism there, because the Thai government recognized that the film was powerful in getting and being heard and seen and listened to, and they made changes. So I'm also a big believer that media can make a difference. So we have a conservationist, we have a philanthropist, we have not a scientist, you have a bureaucrat, yeah, and an entrepreneur, right? Which is great. Well, I'm gonna read you just a little boilerplate so that we know what we're talking, how we're defining the blue economy. Blue economy refers to the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods and jobs, while preserving the health of ocean ecosystems. It encompasses various economic activities related to oceans, seas, and coastal regions. The blue economy is a concept that promotes sustainable economic activities, including fisheries, tourism, maritime transport, and emerging sectors like aquaculture, marine renewable energy, marine biotechnology. The blue economy is already a significant contributor to the global economy, valued at around $1.5 trillion per year, making it the 7th largest economy in the world. Okay, that's the blue economy today, as it is. If American coastal counties were an individual country, they would rank 3rd in the world in GDP, surpassed only by the United States and China. The prosperity and security of this nation is therefore predicated on the understanding, health, and sustainable use of our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes. There are challenges, and we've touched on a few of them. Illegal fishing, pollution, habitat destruction, climate change, Additionally, issues related to governance and international cooperation and the equitable distribution of benefits, and that still needs to be addressed. We're operating in a massive laboratory. Everything we're doing today is an experiment. No, that's what I say about climate change all the time, is that we've never operated on a planet that has 8 billion people on it before. So everything we do is an experiment, and especially when it comes to creating this blue economy. We protected all these beautiful, last panel we talked about treaties and governance, and we've created some really great models. Now we have to harness these economic engines in order to drive these, to fulfill the dreams of these treaties. I don't know, maybe we'll start again with Jeff. How do you feel is conservation a fair word? Yeah? How do you feel like as a conservationist operating in this world today of an emerging or burgeoning blue economy?
I feel defiant.
Defiant?
I mean, I feel like we have to, it's so easy to get caught up in all of the bad things that are happening that we need to have the mental fortitude to just focus on the work day after day after day. And of course, in prepping for this panel, we had a Zoom meeting, and John, I really appreciated the questions that you posed to us as a group because they were simple but profound. And the example and the story that I thought of kind of after we spoke is kind of the epitome of the blue economy in the United States. And basically it made me think of the Florida Keys and the Florida Coral Reef Tract. So let's paint a picture for a moment. We've got the Florida Coral Reef Tract that is under immense pressure. The corals don't look, for the most part, like the corals in this background photo.
Kind of gray and white. And,
they're not very healthy. They're stressors from every which angle, particularly climate change and warming waters. And the thing that really kept coming up in my mind and thinking about our conversation was some of the efforts that are going on down there to try to restore these coral reefs. So there are a number of organizations and science labs and aquaria who are trying to breed climate-resistant, warming-resistant strains of corals and then plant those corals out in the water. And it's a tough haul, right? It's not easy work. The odds of success are pretty long. But these people are doing the work. And so on the optimism side, it's like we're trying to innovate. It doesn't matter how tough the situation looks, we're trying to innovate our way into saving this ecosystem. On the other hand, though, over the past few years, I talked the past 3, 4, 5 years, each summer we've had warming incidents that have been so bad. We're talking 100 degrees Fahrenheit plus warming incidents in these waters, that the scientists who planted these corals have had to get on their scuba gear, go in the water, grab the corals, pull them out, put them in aquaria for weeks or months on end until the water cools enough that they can survive. There is such a mix of emotions when I think about that. There's something wrong with that. Yeah. On the one hand, it's like, this is insane. This is absolute madness. That we are watching the extinction of an entire ecosystem right in front of our very eyes. And we have warmed the waters to the point in our lifetime where these organisms cannot survive. But on the flip side, on the other hand, think about the mentality that you have to have if you have raised these corals, planted them out into the water, and you have to put that scuba gear on to go in the water to try to save them so they don't die forever. Like, that's an act of defiance. And again, I don't know the odds of success. They're probably pretty long in the long run. But that spark to do that, to try to save those corals and save those organisms despite the odds, that is exactly what we need to carry into every room that we have in these international dialogues and international forums. It's so easy to get lost in the conversation, to get bogged down. But every time diplomats are at the IMO trying to negotiate pathways to clean shipping. Every time we're in rooms and conversations trying to hash out a global plastics treaty that actually does it. Every time a country tries to put forward an NDC that actually meets commitments and makes the blue economy a part of those climate commitments to reduce emissions. Every time a country tries to get out ahead of a problem and do something like oppose deep sea mining, those are all acts of defiance. And so that spark is what keeps me going, because we've got to do the work. And the spark that drives people who are doing those kind of things on the water, we can't forget that. Even though our conversations at the global scale are big and vague and amorphous and indefinable at times, we've got to keep that drive.
And Jonathan, do you feel like you're helping to fund defiance?
I was going to dive in a little bit on the finance side from where we're seeing it from the philanthropic perspective. And you know, a sense that I have that, a sense that I have that to some degree, ocean finance is becoming a bit of a victim of its own success. In the sense that in the past 5 years, maybe decade, we've seen a proliferation of new ocean finance mechanisms, tools. Project finance for permanence, debt restructures, debt swaps, debt refinance, blue outcome funds, blue outcome bonds, conservation trusts, ocean trusts. We've seen a variety of different resource mobilization tools at national levels, things like tourist taxes or resource use fees, those kinds of things that can mobilize those resources at national levels. And I think these are all really amazing developments. Each one is a transaction, and I think that is leading to a couple of challenges. One is that something that came up in the first panel that I talked about quite a bit was capacity. A lot of the governments and communities that are trying to help with finance are in fact being inundated with these transactions. And in a sense, some of these transactions are cannibalizing each other. There's a limited number of people in the Ministry of Finance in Mozambique that can, Madagascar, that can actually work with conservation NGOs, with philanthropies, with development banks on these kinds of transactions. And so I think we really need to be thoughtful about how
is there a word or phrase for that? Like, or you're just making that up?
Phrase for
that flooding the zone in regard to.
Flooding the zone.
Yeah, I like that. No, I mean I like it as a storytelling device. Yeah.
I think we really need to be thoughtful in how we're approaching finance, and this is one of the roles that I think philanthropy can help play, because we don't have the long-term finance that we're going after, the 20 billion a year, the 30 billion a year that I talked about with the Global Biodiversity Framework. But we do have funding to be able to convene, bring groups together, talk about how we're going to work with governments, work with communities to coordinate these different financial mechanisms and make sure that they're being robust and practical in how we're identifying finance needs and addressing those finance needs. So it's something that I see as a challenge that we have ahead of us. I don't think it's insurmountable by any means, but it will take stepping back from the transactional notion of getting the deal around these individual mechanisms and wanting to aim for what is the long-term good that we're trying to drive with finance in the ocean space. That's one thing. And the other is coming back around, we cannot overlook the lack of capacity that exists. And as we're engaging on finance, we need to make sure that we're not just going towards what the long-term outcome is in terms of the sustainable finance solution. We need to be building the capacity for governments and communities to be able to engage and have the expertise to be part of the conversation, both now as these solutions are being developed, but over the long term as well as they're being implemented, to be able to represent themselves and their interests in these discussions.
Jen?
Can
I'm sort of reinterpreting the question at this point.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Can I go for it?
You go for it.
Okay.
Well, even though you are stepping away from being an ocean expert, you're a water specialist.
Yes, I am.
Right. So
Freshwater.
when you look out at that horizon line where blue meets blue, I mean, what do you see? You know.
So I'll answer that, but I want to come to this point about finance because I believe it was you, Francois, who made a reference to this earlier about putting words in your mouth. But we tend to get attracted to some of the boutique instruments and the boutique deals around debt for nature swaps or outcome bonds for plastics reduction or blue bonds and so on and so forth. But the real money is going to come from private capital, either into businesses or at scale being invested into countries, for example, through the issuance of bonds. There are other ways, but those are two examples. Or through public expenditure, which is not a sexy topic, which is what are you investing? When you're thinking about small island developing states and you're thinking about their existential threat, half of infrastructure in most small islands is within 500 meters of the coastline. And sea level rise, we know, is increasing, and these surges are threatening basic infrastructure, and public expenditure needs to be redeployed in such a way so that the resilience to an unhealthy ocean, an ocean in crisis for people, is redeployed in other directions in new ways. And that's not stuff that really excites a lot of people who work in finance, and it's not stuff that really excites a lot of people who work in government, or they may not have the capacity necessarily to think about how do you think about tagging your public expenditure in such a way that it makes sense from the perspective of healthy oceans and resilience and adaptation. And similarly, in the world of mobilizing private capital at scale, we have these boutique instruments, but how many can you do? We don't have the KPIs, for example, good, robust KPIs that are linked to things like mangrove health or coral reef health that can attract private capital through issuance of bonds. So there's a lot of basic work we need to do in the world of finance to meet this gap around what is necessary to invest in the ocean every year. I mean, the contribution of a healthy ocean to our economy is vast, but that's really, we're saying about up to $5 trillion of the world economy will come from healthy oceans in the year 2050, but we're not investing in anywhere near the scale that we need to do. And so part of our role as a multilateral development bank is to work with governments to be, in a way, the police traffic cop, to try and think about what are the policies, what are the regulations you need to put in place to redirect those financial flows at a scale that's really, really vast. And I think, as you pointed out, we were saying it's like a bad joke. A conservationist, a philanthropist, a bureaucrat, and an entrepreneur walk into a bar. And, I mean, one of the things we could do is work together to try and bring these ideas to convene, to try and move the real money and to try and move the real action. Because I think we're a long way.
That's a good premise for a joke, but who gets the money?
The ocean and the people who depend on it.
In some of your writings and talks, you've talked about the necessity of avoiding, what you call the hit and run. Does that ring a bell?
I don't know what I said anymore. Did I say that at some point?
Maybe starts off strong and then dissipates.
And then dissipates. Yeah, I mean, and this is why I say the thing that struck me in the first panel was the fact that it's certainly not hit and run. I think we're accelerating. But that we, the world, have been in this battle of trying to save the ocean for a very, very long time. And I'm not pessimistic about events like the UN Ocean Conference. On the contrary, I think they're moments to come together. There needs to be action. We need to move from thinking about what we're optimistic about to putting our money where our mouth is, and to really moving things forward. But we have to be careful as a collective that they don't become talk shops. We have to be really careful as a collective that they lead to commitments on the ground, and that there's sustained progress in the aftermath of these large conventions like the Rio Trio that we just saw in the fall.
Well, Catherine Chabaud was talking about how when she first sailed across the Atlantic, she was stunned by the amount of plastic and how every time she's done it since, it's even more plastic. She's been doing this for more than 20 years, like yourself. And what's the biggest change you think you've seen in 20 years? Is it that rush of young people coming in to participate, or is it something else?
Well, I think the leap. Well, I mean, there are many people here who can speak to this better than I can. But the commitment to taking action legally in terms of treaties. We talk about the plastics treaty and INC process. I will not call it the High Seas Treaty, the BBJ Treaty. I mean, things forward. But we have to be careful as a collective that they don't become talk shops. We have to be really careful as a collective that they lead to commitments on the ground, and that there's sustained progress in the aftermath of these large conventions like the Rio Trio that we just saw in the fall.
Well, Catherine Chabaud was talking about how when she first sailed across the Atlantic, she was stunned by the amount of plastic and how every time she's done it since, it's even more plastic. She's been doing this for more than 20 years, like yourself. I mean, what's the biggest change you think you've seen in 20 years? Is it that rush of young people coming in to participate, or is it something else?
Well, I think the leak. Well, I mean, there are many people here who can speak to this better than I can. But the commitment to taking action legally in terms of treaties, and we talk about the plastics treaty and INC process. I will not call it the High Seas Treaty, the BBJ Treaty. I mean, I think the commitment to action that is enforceable is much stronger than it's ever been. But I think also the risks to resource over-extraction are also much greater than they've ever been. I mean, I think someone mentioned deep-sea mining. I mean, we know what's been in the press in the last week. There is going to be a scramble for resources.
It's already started. Yeah. And Laurent and I, we know each other because we're actually not from the capital, but we're living in New York. And I'm very familiar, as is Laurent, very familiar with the project of a very entrepreneurial guy who has, I met him 20 years ago, and he had this vision of creating sail-powered boats that could deliver goods up and down the Hudson River without using fossil fuels, a throwback to the old carbon-free days. And it's working.
Yes, it's working. I mean,
it's an example, and there is a great French example too, which you know very well.
So there are many examples, and maybe I'll start with Costa Rica with an amazing project in Punta Morales, building from the wood of Costa Rica and replanting trees, building a cargo sailboat in a wood that will be one of the largest, and an amazing project run by a non-profit. The Apollonia, the schooner Apollonia, is sailing up and down the Hudson River, basically bringing goods from the Hudson Valley from upstate New York to the city. It is tough financially to compete with trucks, because that's what they are. They are a truck on the water, not using fossil fuel. Quite a few challenges there. Now they're highlighting as well, I think, what's key in the infrastructure, or let's say the lack of infrastructure, that most of the piers that used to be used for shipping, for loading, docking, offloading, they don't exist anymore. And there's a long, long way to go, but this type of project keep the legacy of shipping by sail while highlighting the many changes that are needed if we want to start replace truck, for instance, by river or ocean shipping. That's a East Coast project. Yesterday I was on the phone with a West Coast project. So in the US, there is momentum. Clipper ship.
Momentum, there's two ships.
Yeah. No, but look, there are very different approaches. Clipper ship is aiming at building an autonomous cargo sailboat that will be able to cross the Atlantic. This is not today possible, first because of regulations. IMO does not allow that. Will that happen ever? I don't know. However, it gives the existing players some sort of another angle to create, to innovate. And that will be helpful for the industry, I believe. The French maritime industry is very strong in this economy. There are thousands of jobs creating by designing new vessels that are able to harness the wind. Equipments, sailing, many types of sails. Some of them, you'll tell me, but that's not sails. No, the suction wings or Flettner rotors, they do not look as sails, but they're able to harness the wind and move the boat.
But there is a French boat that arrives carrying wine and chocolate.
Yes,
correct?
so there is. Actually, I have some chocolate, so I'll make sure it's available at the post.
And they sail across the Atlantic without using carbon-free.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are some very extreme projects that basically say we are building a boat. It will have an engine for port operations, but once we cross the ocean, we don't use the engine. Meaning that the ETA is not perfectly accurate until they're in the middle of the Atlantic. And Grand Sail is one of the pioneers. They bring chocolate, they bring wine. Now they've built a second boat able to carry cosmetics, luxury goods, brandies from France as any shipping companies. And that brings me to maybe scale. And a lot of those projects are starting small. They get the financing, is a mix of public, private, but they're very small. And the scale effect in shipping, in transport in general, is the key to bring down the cost and the emissions per ton. So they're actually today testing the limits. How big can be a boat only powered by sail?
And Jonathan, are there examples of things that you fund or you support that are out of the box, like returning sail freight to our shorelines?
Out of the box, I would say maybe we're not quite that out of the box
I was
in
just
terms
curious.
of the kinds of things that we support. But what I will say is that, you know, what we are able to support, what philanthropy in general is able to support, are the sort of small-scale pilot testing of new ideas, of new ways of doing things, of catalytic funding that can get things started to help move a sector forward, to help move a particular policy objective or outcome forward. And so, for example, I'll say on the blue finance side, sustainable finance side, we're supporting a project in Mozambique right now, which will take a long-range look at what does Mozambique need in terms of sustainable finance to implement its commitment to 30 by 30 for the ocean. So for example, what are the needs that they will have in terms of monitoring, control enforcement, community engagement and awareness building and management efforts for their marine protected areas, for their OACMs that they will establish to meet their target of 16.9% of their ocean protected in MPAs. And then what will be the costs and needs for implementing those effectively over the long term. And this is not something necessarily that governments or financial institutions, other types of donors will come in and lay this groundwork for to kickstart these kinds of conversation, these efforts, getting everybody to the table to do this kind of analysis and develop these kinds of solutions that will be needed. But it's something that philanthropy can step in on and do that kind of convening. What we need, however, is those other institutions, those other donors with larger sums of funding, finance, private sector, ODA, other types of finance to be part of this conversation such that as this process moves forward, those organizations, those donors, those private capital institutions can come in and start to capitalize the solutions that get identified in these kinds of processes. So I'm very empathetic with that kind of process of starting small, doing the convening, pilot testing the new ways of doing business that we can work together on, such that we can be more transformative and move quickly out on implementing these kinds of efforts.
And I kind of know the answer to this, but Bloomberg does spend money on climate change agenda.
Yes, I would say climate work is one of the largest elements of Bloomberg philanthropy, overall's charitable giving, and they're heavily invested in transformation of the energy sector from coal to non-carbon-based solutions, and a whole host of other types of issues that relate not only to the global energy sector, but also to cities and communities and local leaders, and the kinds of support that they need to be able to make the decisions that will change their economies into more climate-friendly approaches.
Jen, do you want to fill us in on what you're working on?
Sure. So, we have several flagship programs in the Global Environment Department of the World Bank, but the one related to a healthy ocean is called ProBlue, and it's a multi-donor trust fund. We have just over $280 million in contributions from 11 sovereign donors, 7 sovereign countries. And we use this as an accelerator program to move the needle on the blue economy, as you so eloquently defined it, within the World Bank. And over the last 5 years, we've seen our portfolio in the blue economy essentially double from just over $5 billion to just over $10 billion, which is a function of using this grant money to do the upstream analytics, to engage in policy dialogue, to do capacity building, and to show some proof of concept. You talked about this a little bit. For example, what it takes to do marine spatial planning, what it takes to think about increasing or changing policies for increased revenues for fisheries sectors and so on. And we've seen also increased demand, because there is more and more of a need from our client countries all over the world. We work all over the world, and this trend is consistent all over the world to do more to address the deterioration of healthy oceans, and to focus on, again, this lifeline for the people, the poor people. I mean, these 3 billion people around the world who depend on the ocean in one way or the other, many of them are the world's poorest people. And so investing in them is something that those governments increasingly want to do. And maybe one last thing I'll say is that about just over a year and a half, 2 years ago, we the World Bank, changed our mission statement. So for decades, we've been an organization focused on poverty reduction, and to some extent, a lesser extent, on reducing the gap in inequality, so therefore sharing prosperity. But our new mission is very clearly a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And that livable planet focus allows us as an environment department and some of our affiliates, such as agriculture and water, to have a sort of central role in the future of development. And so, yeah, through this ProBlue program right now, we're working all over the world on grants from everything from maritime decarbonization to fisheries to plastics reduction to aquaculture, to seed the analytics needed for us to go to much bigger scale with our big money, which is, of course, our International Bank for Reconstruction and Development bank account.
And Jeff, what about the Ocean Conservancy? What are your big, in terms of the blue economy at the moment? What kinds of things are you hopeful for and helping to promote?
Yeah, I mean, as an organization, we basically focus on the 3 big, global crises that are facing the ocean, right? So it's the biodiversity crisis, the plastic pollution crisis, and the climate crisis. And, the thing that, with respect to the blue economy, it's such an interesting mix. The solution sets that we need are such an interesting mix of the old and the new, right? There are many solutions where it's like, we just need to get out of our own way and make it happen. We need to make offshore renewable energy happen, and we need to stop drilling for fossil fuels in the ocean. But there are other areas like, clean shipping that's an interesting mix of like the old, like using wind power, and the new in terms of alternative fuels and carbon-free fuels that need to be the shipping of the future. And so it's such an interesting mix of just getting out of our own way to implement the solutions that we know are there. They're just sitting right there. We just have to seize them, as well as the opportunity to innovate and to develop new technologies and to innovate our economy into the future in a way that is better for us economically, better for our communities, better for the health of people, and better for the health of the ocean overall.
Who here works on fish? Anybody? Everyone. Yeah. How's aquaculture doing? What are the great innovations in aquaculture?
Well, I'm not an aquaculture specialist, but I'm glad you mentioned this, because this is an interesting example of evolution. And I have my aquaculture specialist looking at me, making sure I get this right. But I think last year, maybe the year before, was the first year that aquaculture overtook wild-caught fisheries as a source of aquatic food. So we're seeing a real shift in the market as to where blue food, aquatic foods are coming from. But aquaculture and seaweed and associated markets are dominated by countries in Asia. And we have huge coastlines in the rest of the world, in South America, in Africa, that have not been able to capitalize on these market opportunities. So that is one of the things I'm actually very optimistic about, is these new markets and these new opportunities.
Imagine how our coastline is going to expand once Canada becomes the 51st state.
No comment.
Yeah.
No, on the issue of fish, I think it's an entree to an issue I think be remiss if we did not at least bring up topically here. And in terms of getting out of our own way, fisheries, I think, is a really good example of one of the key sectors where harmful subsidies, money that governments are spending globally, are working counter to the kinds of ocean health and resilience outcomes that we're trying to achieve here. And so,
can you give us an example?
So, sure. There's overcapacity, for example, in fisheries fleets globally. Governments provide low-interest loans, they provide fuel subsidies, they provide gear subsidies, all kinds of other subsidies that make it cheaper for new entrants, existing participants in fisheries to be able to make a profit and for that fishery to be profitable, leading to overcapacity in that sector. And fisheries is just one of the areas where we have this set of harmful subsidies. Globally, we're spending about $1.8 trillion a year on harmful subsidies that are working counter to our nature conservation and resilience objectives. And the $20 billion goal I mentioned earlier, $20 billion a year, that's 4 days of harmful subsidy spending on an annual basis. And so in terms of getting out of our way, this is one of these areas where we really need to rethink these types of subsidies that we have and how we're supporting continued expansion of carbonized shipping versus supporting decarbonized shipping. And the list of opportunities to redirect that funding to new areas that will not only have positive ocean outcomes, but also have positive community and people outcomes as well, is something that I think we really need to take a close look at as we're thinking about the blue economy of the future.
Who can fix that harmful subsidies issue?
Well, the WTO is working on that, and there's a fisheries subsidy agreement that needs some more ratifications before that becomes active. But yeah, I think certainly the WTO, but also individual government action and actions of all of the investment going into the ocean space.
I'm going to suggest that anyone who wants to come visit us in the Hudson Valley, Laurent and I can arrange for you a boat ride on this sail-powered schooner Apollonia. And you can imagine what the New York Harbor would look like, filled with sailboats and men and women unloading the boats versus machines, which is happening in a very, 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 very small way. Does anybody have a question for another? Is everybody happy?
Laurent, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the world of maritime decarbonization, because the share of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from the maritime sector is so high, and the depths of the reform needed in the shipping industry, particularly when so many of these vessels are moored and anchored in third-party countries that have different rules, and they're, the shipping industry is so complicated. Boats owned by other countries and then manned by yet other countries and flags and so on. So I just wanted to hear a little bit your view on the big industry, not necessarily the sailboats.
It's enormous, and I think the maybe where we collectively should start with is the discussions are going on at the IMO today, which is an agency of the UN, but a very, I would say, non-transparent agency. And that's a big question mark. What will get out of that? So there is some improvement going on. As you said, vessels are ranked somehow by their energy efficiency, meaning some countries will now require a certain level of energy efficiency to accept the vessel in their ports. Consequently, those vessels will not call, for instance, EU, but they will call other countries, maybe in Asia or Africa, that do not have set up the same standards. The lifespan of a vessel is very long. So just the maybe a ballpark number, and I could have started with that, but the emissions, GHG emissions coming from global shipping represent 1 billion tons a year, 3% of our total emissions. That's the equivalent of, let's say, Germany or Texas. So that's quite a big chunk of emissions. The pathway that the industry is sort of looking at is, I would say, mirroring the actual business, huge ships, but moving from a fossil fuel oil to a zero emission fuel. So zero emission fuel will be quite similar to the SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. But the starting point is we need renewable energy to produce zero emissions. So the amount of offshore wind farms is just, it's not scalable. It's not possible in a very short term. Thus, a mix indeed of energy would be required, going from improving the efficiency in energy, the shape of the boat, for instance. Today, most of the container ships, if you try to put a sail on those, it's like in your bathtub, you put a sail on your soapbox. It's not going to work. The technology is there with wind propulsion. Catherine Chabaud was saying she sailed around the world in 140 days. It was in '89, I think. That same race finished in January this year. It took the winner 74 days with the same class of vessel. So technologies have improved a lot. Now, how is the industry moving? Is there a collective willingness to change the practices? Will there be measures implemented? Will they be actually very favorable? I'm always taking an example that if I have 2 minutes, but in 2020, the IMO introduced a new regulation about emission of sulfur, basically saying shipping needs to reduce those emissions. That was implemented in a matter of 2-3 years by using either a new fuel, not zero emission, but cleaner fuel, I would say, to reduce the emission at the end, or adding a scrubber that basically is able to collect all the dirty particles and the emissions. Eventually, more than half of the fleet is equipped with scrubbers. The scrubbers exist in 2 different flavors, or anyway, flavors might not be the right term, sorry for my French. One is the closed loop, So the dirty particles, they go into a tank, and the ship will be emptying that tank in the harbor. The second one is open loop, where the dirty particles go to the ocean. So I think collectively at the IMO, there was a capacity to introduce a regulation, but basically harms the ocean through the open loop scrubber.
That doesn't sound right. I mean,
It is not right, but
no,
it is.
but it is, yeah. Huge conversation. Thank you for your participation in trying to explain a little bit. I wish we had capacity to do Q&A, but we do not. So on behalf of the Embassy, I'll say thanks and see you soon.
Can you hear the sounds of the ocean echoing like an SOS? We prefer to listen to the tenderest voices that turn away from it, the outrages of a fragmented world, at a time when territories are coveted and new routes are opening up in the face of melting ice. We prefer to build on our coastlines threatened by rising sea levels. We continue to ride this wave so beautiful and so big that one day we may no longer be able to control. This SOS launched to the world on March 31st from Paris under the symbolic blue light of the Eiffel Tower should inspire new ambition. The ocean is calling us to challenge, but also to countless solutions. We have to respond. The ocean gives us life, food resources, energy, transport required for trade. It is the source of infinite opportunities. Where I grew up in Polynesia, in the heart of the Pacific, the ocean is daily life. I live it, it is my playground, but it is everyone's home and everyone's responsibility. The United Nations, all its member states and society as a whole will be gathering in Nice in June for the biggest summit ever organized on the ocean to celebrate it, govern it better, protect it better, integrate it better into our daily lives. The ocean is a hidden gem which must not come a lawless place. Let's provide a universal legal framework for the high seas. Let's provide the billions needed for the blue economy, for the decarbonization of our maritime transport, for science, for knowledge of our blue planet. We have no more time to waste. Be part of history. Be at the United Nations Ocean Conference. Maururu te moana.